Okay, I'm going to admit them now. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to all of our alumni joining us. Welcome. Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Leparati. I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Baruch College. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Zooming here from Astoria, Queens. Feel free to put in the chat where you're Zooming from. It's been very cool to see alumni joining us from all over the world for these events. And today's event's going to be super interesting. We're talking about a very important topic for interviewing strategies and video interviewing. And we're going to be led by an alum, as well as Marian Verret from the Star Career Development Center. A few quick ground rules for the evening. You can leave your cameras on if you'd like. We like to see everyone's smiling faces, but please make sure to mute your microphones. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please direct them to the chat bar, and we will get to them throughout the presentation. And all that being said, I'd now like to introduce Marian Verret. Take it away, Marian.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I quickly introduce Farzana, I work as an adjunct career counselor in the Star Career Development Center. So I mainly work with our technology leadership development program, where I spearhead a group of students who are interested in a career in technology. In our office, as an alumni who did their undergraduate degree, you do have services available to you. You definitely have, lifetime access to Star Search. Job database, and we also have some resources in there for free. So if you did your undergraduate degree at Baruch, an alum, you can definitely make sure you claim your Star Search account. There are some resources in there, like Vault has some wonderful free features. I mean, there are free features of Vault, but then if you log in through Star Search, there's the paid features that you have free access to. We have other things. We have mock interview modules, especially now with what Farzana is going to cover today. It's important to know sort of where you are with your interviewing skills online. And one of the resources we have is we have this mock interview module where you can sort of do a mock interview where you have a video camera, but it's not taking up space into your computer. So it kind of goes recorded into the cloud. So that makes it a little easier. And it gives you sort of a unique link that you can send to anyone. So that way you're not sending them a huge file, like video files tend to be very big. You're just sending them a link, and that person could sort of give you some feedback based on your mock interview. We also have a weekly alumni newsletter. I'll put it in the chat in a little bit if you're interested in, and that's for everyone. Anyone who wants to receive our weekly alumni newsletter. This is any type of resources that we're aware of, any type of events, career fairs, things like that, that we know is available to the alumni population. We will send it through that listserv. So I'll send it in the link in the chat in a second. But if you want to be part, if you're not part of that already, and you want to get that listserv, you do have to go to that link, sign up, and we send it out usually on Thursday evenings. My colleague Gerald will send that out on Thursdays. So if you're interested in that, just put that in the link. We also have a weekly sort of drop-in walk-ins on Thursdays from 12 to 1. So if you have like a quick question, that's a time where one of us could sort of spend 15 to 20 minutes with you, and it's first come, first serve. And it's all virtual. So STAR is running virtually for the fall semester, and hopefully we'll see in the future how that will go. So now, if you have any questions afterwards about career services and resources available to you, I'll definitely be able to answer towards the end.
You know what, Marian, I just wanted to quickly also say, I put in the chat, but I know we get this question all the time. We will provide a recording of this webinar afterwards, as well as the slides. So you will be able to refer to all of that afterwards. We'll send that out a day or two after the event.
Yeah,
thanks, Marian.
Thank you. So now I want to turn it over to Farzana. Farzana is, I'm glad and fortunate to have worked with Farzana. She was one of our peers that helped work with our students one-on-one, and now she's really devoted a lot of her time to helping our students and our alumni. And she'll talk about herself, but I'm so honored that she was able to join us and take time to do this presentation today. So thank you, Farzana, for doing this today.
Right, thanks, Marian, and thanks, Alex. Thank you all for joining. I'm so excited to be able to share some of the tips that I've learned. So I am the HR manager at S9 Architecture. We're an architecture firm in Chelsea, in the city, and we do projects around New York and outside of New York as well. And in terms of my role, so I've been at S9 for about 3 years at the end of this month. And I basically do a little bit of everything. So I handle benefits, I handle like immigration, like work visas for our employees. I handle, and then I handle recruiting as well as a bunch of other things here and there within HR. So as you all know, like with everything that's going on now, video interviewing has become the new norm. So I'll touch a little bit about that. I graduated from Baruch in 2013. I double majored in psychology and corporate communications, and then I pursued my master's in mental health at Brooklyn College. And I transitioned into HR, never quite went into mental health counseling. All right, so with that, I'll get started. All right. So here's what I have on the agenda for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about job search success strategies because I think it's important and it goes hand in hand with acing the interview. And then I'll talk a little bit about acing a phone interview because typically nowadays a phone interview tends to be the first step before you actually get to the video interview in some cases. I'll also talk a little bit about what a digital interview is versus a video interview. We'll touch on why employers are transitioning to this new style of interviewing. And I'll talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of these new types of interviews. And then I'll share some tips for acing these interviews and we'll open it up for questions. All right. So in terms of job search success strategies, the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that when you apply for positions, you're applying for positions that you're genuinely interested in. I know with the times that we're in, you know, getting a position sometimes is the priority. And, you know, if you're qualified for the position and you sort of just need it, you know, there's the reality of that. But typically the best way to do it is to apply for something that you are really interested in, thinking about long-term sort of success in a role. The other thing is also tailor your resume to each position. So what I usually advise is having like one master resume where you have all of your experiences, right? So your educations and then all of your experiences with all of the bullet points outlining what you've done. And then sort of based on what you're applying for, you look at the job description, you say, okay, I can use my experience from here and this role and sort of pick and choose from your experiences to kind of see what tailors best to that role. So it does take some time and effort, but it's definitely worth it. Keep track of the positions you apply for. I think this is really important. Something as simple as just having a spreadsheet and having like the position title, the company name, perhaps even copying, pasting in the job description or putting a link to the job description, the date you applied to the position, perhaps having any kind of contact information for the recruiter if that's listed on there, and then listing the documents you submitted, whether it's a resume, cover letter, just a resume. And the reason I advise this is because sometimes you get a random call and they're like, hi, you know, hi Farzana, like I'm calling from this company. I see you applied. And if you applied to like 30 different jobs, you could be taken aback and say, wait, where did I apply to? So having a spreadsheet where you can kind of go back and say, oh yeah, I remember, I think that'll be really helpful. And it certainly wouldn't make it seem like you just applied for the sake of applying. And then basic, just check your email regularly. Make sure you check your spam folder just in case you get any sort of updates. Sometimes if you get an automatic update from a system, it sometimes goes straight into your spam. So just be mindful of that. And then make sure your voicemail is set up with your name. So you really don't want, you know, them to call and kind of hear a ringtone, like some sort of song or, you know, playing. I think it's best to just have your name. That's the most professional way to have your voicemail set up. The other thing is if you're going through a recruiter or if you're in touch with a recruiter for a particular role, like make sure you follow up with them. Follow up if like 2 weeks is usually the rule of thumb. If you've spoken to them and you haven't heard anything back, follow up. But with this tip, just be careful to not follow up excessively, right? So make sure that, you know, you're being professional, but not, you know, for lack of a better term, obnoxious in the sense of, you know, every time you're just saying, hey, I didn't hear from you, I didn't hear from you. Just kind of have that balance. And then the best tip is network, like really just network. A lot of times it's who you know. Sometimes just knowing someone who know someone else who's looking for someone and you're a good fit, that could really help. I've actually gotten, this is my third job that I've gotten, and all three jobs I've gotten have been through networking. So really, like, networking is so key to sort of landing a role. All right. And then in terms of basic interviewing techniques, review your resume. So Marian mentioned that there are services offered to alumni about just getting your resume reviewed. Capitalize on that, take advantage of it. Prepare your introduction. So we'll talk very briefly about this, but your introduction is basically like your personal pitch, who you are. So when they say, tell me about yourself, what is your response to that? That's a really important question. Research the organization. This is really important. I'll share some of my experiences, and I can't tell you how many times I've ruled out a candidate just because I asked them, why are you interested in S9 architecture? And they can't give me an answer, right? They haven't researched our projects. They don't even know what the role they're applying for is. To me, it's very off-putting. It's, well, you're just applying to us just to apply. And so part of what we look for is somebody who is passionate about what we do and passionate about our organization. And that could be sort of applied to any other organization as well. Dress rehearsal. So make sure that you wear proper attire. So even if you're doing a phone interview or if you're doing a video interview, dressing the part is half of it, because the way you dress is going to kind of help set your mindset, right? So if you're in your pajamas, you might just naturally be a little bit more laid back. Whereas if you at least put on like a dress shirt or, something, then you're kind of feeling, kind of getting into the role and getting into that professional mindset. Know the flow of the interview. So picking up on nonverbal cues of the interviewer is really important. So if you're answering a question and you're going on and on and on, and you see the interviewer kind of like dazed out, or you see on their face, you can kind of tell that they're not really engaged, that should be a cue for you to either shift what you're saying or wrap it up really quickly, because it's important to get them to be engaged. Anticipate questions. So prepare success stories using the STAR method. So this is really important. And the STAR method, like this particular item is really important, especially when it comes to the video interviewing thing, portion of it, I think. The reason being is when you're doing a video interview, half of what you would have in the in-person interview is gone, right? So you're not going to have that opportunity to fully show the nonverbals, to fully show all of the cues that you could when you are in person with someone. So a lot of it is going to be based on what you say. So I'll go through an example shortly about how to use the STAR method when you're answering a question. And I think that's really helpful for video interviews in general. Prepare your questions to ask the interviewer. So never, ever, ever, ever say that you do not have any questions to ask the interviewer, right? So at the end of the interview, it's pretty typical for them to say, okay, do you have any questions for me? And it is the worst answer you can give to that is, I don't have any questions. Now, if it's your third interview with someone and with the company and you understand, that's different. But if it's your first interview and you have no questions for them, then you're basically telling them you understand everything there is to understand about the position, everything there is to understand about their company. And so you're very well equipped. And that's probably not the case. So something as simple as, what qualities have you found to be successful, for this role? Or even asking something about the culture. And preparing your questions, when you do the research of the organization, that's really going to help you with figuring out what questions to ask. For example, if you're researching an organization and you see that they have a blog, and on their blog, they talk about how every year they have a day dedicated to doing community service, right? So one of the questions you can ask is, you can refer to that and say, I noticed that that's part of the culture. Can you tell me a little bit more about the culture of your firm? Right? So you're building off of what you've already done in your research. And if it's something you're genuinely interested in knowing, it'll come off that way. So that's just one example of how you can ask a question or think about what to ask. Just be sure that you're not asking anything that has already been answered. So for example, if they already told you, the office location that you'll be working at, you don't want to ask that, because then it'll seem like you weren't paying attention. And then the last two pieces are the closing. So that's just sort of like, after they ask you if you have anything, it's sort of like, it's a pleasure speaking with you. And then in the closing, you want to ask for the contact information if you don't already have it. So when we're talking about video interviews, chances are you already have their contact information because you've been emailing them or, messaging them on LinkedIn. But it's always good that if you have a second person that interviewed you, and you don't have their email address, be sure to get it so that you can write that thank you email. The thank you note has sometimes, in my experience, it's sort of made a decision for us. So for example, there have been times where we've been down to 2 candidates and one sends a thank you note and one doesn't. And for us, that makes the decision because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to choose. And the candidate who sent the thank you note shows that extra step, that they're more professional. And so for us, that sort of made it for us. And it's different from person to person, but it's really important to send the thank you note. All right. So the next piece is the personal pitch. I have a video which I'm not going to play, but we can share this presentation after and you can access the video to see it. But I will go over elevator pitch. So your elevator pitch is basically the same thing as your personal pitch. And that is, in an interview, typically the first question that they'd ask is tell me about yourself, right? The interviewer would basically ask you to give a brief summary of who you are. This is something that you should really put time and effort into crafting. It is a work in progress, just like your resume. It's always going to change. But it's basically an infomercial about your professional self. And it typically is 30 seconds. Sometimes it can be a little bit longer depending on the situation. So if you're in an interview, it will typically be like 30 seconds, right? If you're at a networking event, it could be shorter. It could sometimes be, a little longer. And the reason they call it an elevator pitch is because imagine you are, in an elevator with the CEO of a company and you have 30 seconds to make a case for yourself, 30 seconds to tell them who you are and why you should work for them. That's what the idea of the personal pitch is. And it contains the most important and relevant information that you want them to know. So it could be, perhaps you can tell them about where you went to school, or it could tell them about the quality of experience that you've had, or what you're looking for, or why their company, or a little bit of all of those. So this is something that you really want to work on because every single interview basically asks this question. All right, so I'll touch on phone interviews. Like I mentioned, typically when we have video interviews now, at least the way I've been doing them is I do a phone screen first. The reason being is we have so many candidates. So if we post a job, typically within a day now, we get like 100 candidates. And so, you kind of look through all the resumes and you see who are the strong candidates. And I want to give all of them a fair chance, right? So I do a phone interview to kind of screen them to see, okay, who are you? What are your interests? What are you looking for? And do you have what it takes to kind of do this job? Do you have the relevant experience? So with a phone interview, it's typically, sometimes it can be 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour. And it's more on a just get to know you, sort of basis. When you do a phone interview, there are certain things that you would want to follow. So here's some tips. Research the company. So I'm always going to have this tip no matter what kind of interview you do, because it is so important to know what you're applying for and why you want to work for that company. Know what position you're interviewing for. So, this is really important too, because how are you going to know how to hone your skills or how to sell yourself if you don't understand what the skills that are required for the position are? Confirm the phone interview details. So before you actually, before the day of the interview, follow up with the recruiter if they don't follow up with you to say, hi, just confirming that my interview is whichever day, whatever time, and make sure you're in the same time zone too. Secure a quiet space for the interview. So you really don't want, a lot of noise in the background, any kind of, if they're doing construction in your area and you know that, plan ahead and try to secure a space that's quieter. And make sure you get cell reception. So I don't know how much this would apply to anyone on the call, but if you're not using a landline, which most people don't even have anymore, and if you're using your cell phone, just make sure that you have cell reception where you are. Make sure that your cell phone is charged, make sure that you're good to go, and make sure that you're expecting the call. So, you know, during that time that your call is scheduled, make sure that you're not on another call. Keep your line open. Dress the part. So I alluded to this already. The way that you dress is really important. So even if they won't be seeing you through the phone, but it's about the mindset that you're getting yourself into. You want to be in a professional mindset since you are doing, you know, you're doing an interview that is really important. It can get you to the second step of getting this job. And then don't rely on sticky notes. So it's really helpful sometimes to have little things written down on sticky notes, but it can also be really overwhelming because then you kind of forget which sticky note has which thing on it. So the best thing to do is just prepare. You know, run through your questions, go through your resume, make sure you know what's on your resume. You can have things written down on a sticky note, but try not to rely on it because it can really throw you off. Okay, so now we get to the meat of the presentation. So nowadays they do a lot of, you know, interviewers, recruiters, video interviews and digital interviews have become the new norm. More recently because of COVID, and so a lot of people are working remotely. So, you know, for safety purposes, they're not inviting people into the office to do an interview. And then there's other reasons as well, and we'll get into that, but that's the most relevant reason nowadays. So there are two types of interviews. There's a digital interview and a video interview. Now, both of them are basically enhanced phone interviews in the sense that in addition to having audio, right, there's also a video component to it. With the video interview, it's basically a real-time interaction with the interviewer, meaning, you know, sort of like how the Zoom call is going on, it's a real-time interaction. That's sort of what the video interview is. With the digital interview, I find this is less common with experienced recruiting, which is basically anyone post-graduation. This is more common with campus recruiting. Digital interviews are more common with, you know, internship roles or entry-level roles for students who just graduated. And what it is basically the interviewers roll out. They have like an interface, and you log in, and there's there's questions there. And what you have to do is you're recording yourself answering the questions, right? So it'll say, tell me about yourself. You'll record yourself saying what it is. So you're not talking to anyone, but you're recording yourself. Sometimes they put a cap on how many times you can redo the question. And then once you finalize all your answers, you submit it to the recruiter, right? So that's the two differences. What would apply to probably most of you on this call would be the video interview, but I'll touch a little bit on both. Okay, so here are some of the tips for acing a remote interview, right? So one of the things is make sure that you buy or borrow the tech equipment that you need. So most computers nowadays come with a built-in webcam, but not everyone has an updated computer. So if you need an additional webcam, if you don't have a webcam and you're doing a video interview, it's really important that you are actually on the video. So make sure that you have the equipment that you need. If you have a tablet, make sure that everything's set up. If you have a computer, just make sure that whatever technology that you need, you have it well before the call. The other thing is know how to use your technology and practice beforehand. So right now we're using Zoom, but there's also Microsoft Teams, there's WebEx. There's a lot of different platforms that recruiters can use. So just make sure you're familiar with it. Understand which platform will be used for your interview. So Zoom tends to be the most popular these days, but some companies still use Skype and some companies use Microsoft Teams. So it's just really important to have that familiarity. And, depending on the role you're applying for, it's also a way to demonstrate that you're tech savvy, right? So if you're having challenges sort of setting things up, it may sort of show that you're not as tech savvy, and then it could be really bad, especially if on your resume you have that you're very tech savvy, right? So being prepared is key here. And then sounding like a broken record, make sure that you dress the part, right? So I can't emphasize this enough. It is really important that you dress the part, not only because they'll be seeing you on video, right? But also because you have to put yourself in that mindset. And then just be sure that if you're getting dressed and you're wearing, like in this case, the gentleman is wearing a dress shirt and a tie, make sure that, you know, you're fully dressed and, you know, you're well, because if you get up and you move away from the camera and you're wearing pajama pants, you don't want them to see that. So just be mindful of all of that. Make sure that you're dressed appropriately for the interview. Find a place in your home or nearby that will be quiet and have good internet connection. Now, I will say this, I think with more people working from home, interviewers, including myself, tend to be a little bit more lenient if there's like a dog barking in the background or a baby crying, or if there's some noises, you know, there's that understanding that, you know, everyone is working from home, or, you know, in addition to being employees, we're parents, we're, you know, we're kids, we have kids. So I think having that understanding helps, but as quiet as you can make the place, that's better. And I'll give you an example of planning ahead. So I once did an interview with a gentleman who was in England. So daytime for us was afternoon, late night for him. And he had a very young child. And so he did tell us ahead of time, he planned ahead and he told us, you know, my son will be sleeping at that time probably, but if you hear crying or anything, please disregard that, because, you know, that's around the time that he wakes up for his feeding, right? So even just planning ahead like that, interviewers tend to be understanding. So in as much as you can kind of plan, let them know, you know, if you know that there's a chance that there'll be noise or anything like that, you know, in a professional manner, you can just kind of set that expectation. And that's something to be mindful of as well. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and so we'll understand. Have everything that you'll need at hand for the interview. So make sure that you have a copy of your resume in front of you. I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you know what's on your resume. You don't want being asked questions about your resume and your experience and then kind of looking down on a piece of paper to try to figure out, oh yeah, that's what I did, right? You want to be able to kind of account for everything that you've done. You want to be able to account for gaps in your resume. So if you do have gaps in your resume, make sure that you're able to explain why those gaps are there. Whether it's because you lost a job and it was hard to find another job, whether it's because you were transitioning roles, whether it was because you had a personal thing going on, whatever it is, you don't be surprised if you're asked about those gaps. If you have roommates, just make sure that they're aware that you have something going on, that you have an interview, so that they don't, you know, barge into the room, or they're mindful of not making too much noise. So all of these things are really important. I wanted to touch base on the STAR method that I had referred to before. So basically for the STAR method, when you answer a question, when you're asked for video interviewing or any interview, if they say, tell me about a time that, you know, tell me about a time when you had a challenging situation. Tell me about a time when you made a difference in your organization, right? So the method that you want to use when you answer these questions is you want to state what the situation was, right? You want to tell them what the task at hand was. So situation, task. Then you want to say what the action was, what action did you take to remedy the situation? And then you want to talk about the results. What was the results of the whole thing? Because if you state the situation and you state what you do, but you don't talk about the results, it doesn't really bring the point home. So I wrote down an example that was very pertinent to my role, especially during the early stages of COVID when we started working from home. So one of the problems that our organization had was that employee morale was really low. And this was due to limited interaction with coworkers. So, you know, a lot of people were quarantining at home by themselves. A lot of our employees had families abroad or out of state. And so they were really like probably quarantining by themselves in a one studio apartment in the city. And it gets really lonely. They don't get to interact with their coworkers. So employee morale was really low. My task was my goal was to brainstorm and execute creative ways to increase employee engagement, right? So that was what my task at hand was. My action was the way that I reacted to the situation was that I planned weekly firm-wide virtual happy hours, right, via Zoom. And during this time, I facilitated fun activities for the employees. And so this encouraged participation. So for example, I did a scavenger hunt where I had everyone running all over their house looking for random items, right? Like a Band-Aid or a fork or a pointy, like, you know, like a red shiny object. We also did like human bingo, where you have to talk to each other to kind of, you know, find out, you know, who's gone skiing before, who went bungee jumping, who has a twin. And then the result of all of that was that employees reported feeling a greater sense of team spirit since the virtual happy hours were implemented. So that was my result, and that's what I measured it by. When we did a survey before returning to studio, before we returned to work, we did a survey to gauge how people were feeling. So that's an example of how you can do the situation, task, action, result. Now, I went into details and mine was a little long-winded, but that's the format you want to take when you're answering these types of questions. Because ultimately, every time you answer a question, you want to keep at the back of your mind, what is your purpose in answering this question? What point are you trying to get across? All right. Okay, so kind of going into that, switching gears a little bit. So some of the additional tips for acing these types of interviews is similarly, you want to sit in a well-lit room. So you want to make sure that you can see, like the person can see you and you can see them, that you're not, you know, that it's not pitch black. And then you don't want to have a whole bunch of, like, my background is not the ideal background. I have too many colors going on. I'm in the middle of moving, so it's kind of crazy, but you know, you kind of want to have more of a neutral. I saw Marian, I think earlier, had he had, I think, Baruch background on there. So you can, with Zoom, you could put up a background if that's easier. Yeah, so you do have it. So you have like a background that you can put up. That might even be a way to go. Test out the internet connection beforehand, right? So technology, you know, it's inevitable sometimes that you'll have problems with it. Right. And that's just how it is. You roll with the punches when it happens, but as much as you can avoid it, try to be engaged with the camera. So if you're talking to the person, you don't want to be looking to the left or to the right or looking around. You want to kind of make as much eye contact as you can through the camera. Like I mentioned, plan ahead. So similar with that experience of the individual that we interviewed in London, who sort of said, hey, I have a baby. You might hear crying in the background, but I'll try to minimize it. So plan ahead, whether it means doing something on your end or just giving the recruiter a heads up that, hey, this might happen. Practice in an interview location. So wherever you're gonna interview, where you're gonna take the interview, make sure that the connection there as well. Make sure that the lighting there as well. Make sure that you're comfortable in the space. Time your responses. So you don't want to kind of go off on long-winded responses to questions. You want to be as concise as possible, making sure that you answer the questions that were asked, right? So, and a lot of this comes down to really reading the interviewer's face. I've been in interviews where the candidate is going on, and I'm sitting there and I'm trying to stay engaged, but they cannot read off my face that, you know, it's sort of like, okay, let's kind of wrap this up. So kind of having that insight is really important. Pay really close attention to the expression on the interviewer's face. You can use sticky notes if needed. I think sometimes, you know, there's a lot of anxiety associated with doing an interview in general. So I think if you have little notes of things that you're scared you'll forget but are really important, you can write them down. Just try not to rely too heavily on those. And most importantly, breathe. Just remember that, like, the best you can do is just prepare and put your best foot forward, and then, you know, you take it from there. So just remember to take a deep breath, kind of, you know, as long as you do everything you can to prepare, you will be okay. Now, here are some of the things you don't want to do. So you don't want to have any kind of physical distractions, like any kind of posters or anything, you know, that's not neutral in your background. And you also don't want to have any kind of auditory distractions. So as I mentioned before, if you are in an environment where they're probably doing construction right outside and you know it's going to be going on while you're having your interview, you may want to make arrangements to have your interview somewhere else. You don't want to wear casual clothes. I think I have gone on this one point so many times, so I'm not gonna, you know, go too much into that one. You don't want to give overly long answers, so be concise. And you don't want to look down frequently at your resume or your notes. So think about it. When you go for an in-person interview, the same way that you won't look at your resume when they ask you a question, like if they say, hey, so when you were at Ernst & Young, how, you know, what did you do? You don't want to go to your resume and start reading off your bullet points. You want to be able to explain to them what you did. So similarly, you want to be prepared. You don't want to be looking down at your paper. And one of the tips you can do is you can stick a sticky note next to your camera, right? So that when you're looking at the sticky note, it looks like you're looking at the camera. But that's only if really necessary, right? Like if you can avoid it, avoid it. But that's one tip. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about the why. Like, why is this the new norm, right? Why are employers shifting this way? So as I mentioned before, the most obvious answer is because of COVID-19 and because a lot of people are working from home as a result. So offices are closed. It's not feasible to go into the office to meet with someone. But there are other reasons for this too, because even before COVID, there was a shift of going towards video and digital interviewing. So some of the other reasons are assessing key skills. So, you know, before I joined S9, I used to work at Ernst & Young as a campus recruiting coordinator. And one of the things that we found was that when you would bring in, you know, students for interviews or any kind of, even if it's a postgraduate person, sometimes you would bring them in, and then in the interview, from the second they open their mouth to answer the tell me about yourself, you realize that perhaps their communication skills are not great, right? And so sometimes the way that you assess a communication skills is by doing a phone screen or by doing a video interview. And so that way you're saving your time, you're saving the candidate's time in the sense of commuting. They don't have to commute to you. You don't have to commute somewhere else. Like you're basically you're assessing their communication skills. You can also assess their technical skills by asking them certain questions to see if what's on their resume is actually what they've done. It's also lower cost because of the commuting factor. It saves time. And then for the scheduling piece really applies to digital interviewing, because digital interviewing is a one-way sort of way of doing things. It's just more convenient for whenever the person can do it, they do it. And then whenever the reviewer can check the interview, they log into the portal and they check the interview. And then by doing digital or video interviews, you can actually interview more candidates, right? Because instead of having employers having individuals commute to the office, you can just do 15-minute calls, right? Versus having someone come into the office for 15 minutes, right? You can kind of interview more candidates. So from an employer perspective, it is helpful because we're able to kind of have more candidates so that we can kind of assess who's the better fit for the role. And then some of the pros and the cons of remote interviewing. With regards to digital interviewing, it's less pressure on candidates because they're not really talking to someone in real time. They're just recording themselves. And then scheduling, like I mentioned before, and can answer the same question multiple times. So with digital interviewing, you can answer basically the question. I think they cap it at like 3 times, right? So if you don't like the way you answer it the first time, you can answer it again, and you can answer it a 3rd time before you submit it. Now, those are for digital interviewing, but for video interviewing, there's also the convenience of not having to worry about what if my train is late? Like, what if I don't get there in time? What if it's pouring and then I'm soaked by the time I get there, right? There's this convenience factor to doing video interviewing where you can say, okay, I can get up at 8 a.m., I take a shower, I can get ready, and I'll be in front of my computer by 9 a.m. the latest, right? So you don't have to worry about traffic. And then there's the cons, right? So in terms of digital interviewing, it could be uncomfortable to record yourself. And in terms of video interviewing, it can kind of be uncomfortable to see yourself at the corner of the screen, right? Like, you know, you're interacting with someone and you can kind of see yourself. And that could be really uncomfortable for some. There's also the inevitable technology issues, right? Sometimes Zoom will decide not to work or it'll end. I remember I had an interview via video about a year ago, and the recruiter was having challenges on her end. Her video wasn't showing, and then I couldn't hear her. So when I started seeing her face, when her video worked, her audio went off, and then vice versa. So we ended up just, you know, kind of rescheduling the interview altogether. And then there's the poor video quality. So sometimes if your internet isn't working well, it can affect the quality of your video. Sometimes it can be, you know, the webcam itself that you're using. That one is preventable, but the internet connection isn't. So there are some cons that come along with, you know, depending on technology. Okay, so I covered a lot. I left a lot of time for question and answers because I wanted to sort of be able to answer any specific questions that anyone had.
I guess I have a question. We see, I kind of like did an interview a little while ago, and I did send like a thank you letter, and they responded. The last time I did that was like maybe like 2 months ago, and I don't know if I should like contact them again anytime soon, because I don't know.
So you sent them a thank you note after the interview, and they responded to you, and since then you haven't heard back about the role. Is that correct?
Yeah, kinda.
So, and how long? It's been 2 months, you said?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess that's a bit, I would have recommended following up perhaps like maybe like 2 weeks or so after, but you can certainly send a note to the recruiter and just say, hi, just checking in. It's been a while since we've connected and wanted to know if the position, you know, like if the position is still something that's something that's still open, that you're very interested. So you can still reach out, you can reiterate your interest, and you can ask, you know, if they're still sourcing for the position, sort of. By just telling them that you're still interested and following up, I think at this point, even though it's been 2 months, you know, there's really no harm in doing that. Now, if when they responded to you, they told you that they weren't interested, right? Like, let's just say they responded, they say, hey, thanks for speaking. Thanks for your note. It was great meeting you. At this time, we're unable to extend an offer. In a case like that, then there's really nothing, you know, to follow up on, right? But if they never gave you an answer as to whether they want to hire you or not, then it's totally fine to follow up on that with them and just reiterate your interest.
Well, I mean, I kind of got the role, like, the response letter seems to like heavily imply that.
What specifically did they say, if I may ask, that made you think that you got the role?
Well, there was some parts that were like thanking me, like with the whole interview, like the stuff. It's a little complicated for me to explain. Never mind.
Okay.
I'll explain later.
Well, I do think that typically if they're interested in moving forward, that they would sort of kind of follow up. If they did say, hey, we are interested, they would have potentially followed up with an offer letter. However, it is natural that things fall through the cracks sometimes. And I think with COVID, you know, with the pandemic and us being in a pandemic, a lot of roles went on hold. We know, like, we had extended offers to our interns for the summer, and we had to circle back with them and you know, say, we're so sorry that we're unable to hire you because we won't be able to give you the type of experience that we would like to give our interns because we're not in the office. So it could have been something like that. I think following up just for clarity doesn't hurt. I think I would just advise you to be mindful of the way in which you approach it. So your wording, and that's sort of the best advice I can give based on the information you shared.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. And definitely later, if you want to talk one-on-one after everyone, I'm happy to do that. So next we have a question from Bianca. If you meet with multiple people on the same interview, do you recommend to send thank you notes to each person you met with?
I do. So I can tell you from two perspectives. So as an HR person, I find it very meaningful that if 3 of us interview a candidate and the candidate sends a note to each of us, even if it's basically the same thing with one line differing, I find that to mean so much, because it's like, wow, like they could have just sent it to one person and say, hey, can you just forward it to everyone else? But they didn't do that. They took the extra time. So for me personally, I really value that. I think that, you know, on the flip side, it's not the worst thing if they send a note to everyone and say, hi, thank you all for interviewing me. I appreciate it. It doesn't count against you by any means, but you certainly, in my books, get brownie points if you send a letter to each person who interviewed you. I think it's that personal factor that just adds to it. And I think it's very telling on you and your character. So I would definitely recommend doing that. And again, it doesn't have to be significantly different. And in my office, at least when we interview, we do talk about it after. We're like, did this person send you a note? Like, they didn't send me a note. So we do naturally talk about it. And when I worked at EY, the way that it would work was we would have super days. So we would interview like 30 candidates in one day. And after all those interviews, we would sit down around a big round table and we would start giving feedback. Each interviewer would go around and give their feedback on their candidates. And basically, at the end of that day, we would more or less decide on who we're bringing on board, right? So in a case like that, you know, the thank you notes still come into play, because if we're on the fence about someone and they send a thank you note, that can really help their case.
Absolutely. I think it's always important to send thank you notes. I know in my previous roles, I might not always read thank you notes, but for some reason, I always know who didn't send it. So, so we have another question from Uriel. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. What tips do you recommend on how to research a company, and also how much information is enough?
That's a good question. So first resource would be the company's website, right? So go to the company's website, look at their about us. You know, even a lot of companies also have like their team. So you can see who their team's comprised of. You can read some bios. If you know who's interviewing you, you can even probably read their bio. That doesn't hurt. So their company website is the first one. LinkedIn. So look at their LinkedIn profile. Sometimes the LinkedIn profile will have things that perhaps the website itself doesn't. And then sometimes on the website, there's sometimes a link to a blog. Perhaps the company has a sector that posts a blog, and they talk about where they are in the media, or they talk about, you know, what sort of things they do to build culture. You don't have to spend, you know, like an inordinate amount of time researching it, but you should put the effort in. I would say probably, you know, and I mean, depending on how fast you research, but I would say probably like an hour minimum of looking through the website and just understanding, you know, why do I want to work for them? As you're reading the information, question, what is it about them that I like? Because when you're answering that question, you have to remember, try not to be generic, because ultimately, you know, if your question doesn't specifically answer why them and not their competitor, you know, not directly, but it doesn't allude to it, then, you know, is it a generic answer? So for example, you know, like I know when I applied to EY, like the reason I wanted to work there was that I saw the type of corporate, like how much they valued corporate responsibility. Now, does that mean Deloitte and KPMG and PwC don't? No, they do as well, right? They're very similar in how they do it. But I talked about specific things that EY did within their contributions to the community and how it resonated with me. So, you know, I think just doing just enough? And I guess there's no exact answer for it, but enough to know why you want to work there.
Thank you. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if you did get your undergraduate degree at Baruch, and you have access to Star Search, you do have access to Vault, which has tons of information with regards to employers, so you can access that. If you don't have a Star Search account, I'll send an email. I'll put an email on the chat so you can email us and with certain information so that we can get you set up. Another question, follow-up question from Bianca. If you have contact information for only one person and you did a group interview, but you don't have the other people's contact information, what should I do, and how should I go about getting that information?
So this happens all the time in my role. Sometimes the candidate will have my contact information and not the other interviewers. Basically what they do is just send me a note and say, "Hi, Farzana, it was a pleasure meeting with you." They write their thank you note to me and they say, "Can you please provide me with my other interviewer's email? I would like to send them a thank you note," right? And I never don't send it. I always send it. And that's part of the reason why also you ask for the business card when you do an in-person. You ask for a business card, but doing it virtually, you can simply ask the person whose contact information you have. And I don't know that they wouldn't disclose it to you.
Great. Thank you. Another question. If an interviewer doesn't get a response to their thank you letter, does it mean he or she still has a chance to be hired? Or should an interviewer expect a response to a thank you email?
So that really depends on the person, right? So for me in HR, I always respond to the thank you notes, whether we'll hire the person or not, right? I always say thank you. I acknowledge the fact that the person took the time to send me a thank you note. But sometimes I reply to a thank you note knowing that we're not going to move forward with them, right? And I know that really sucks, but I just like to respect the fact that they sent it to me. Similarly, I've had instances where, some of the people in my firm who've interviewed, they don't respond to the thank you note, and it is somebody that we're going to hire. So that one is a really tough question to answer because it's really dependent on the person who you're sending the thank you note to. You can have someone like me who will respond even if you wouldn't get the role, and you'd have somebody who wouldn't respond even if you would get the role.
Right, thank you. I had one question. In your opinion, in this is, applicant tracking system is always a conversation that people talk about with regards to resumes. Do you know if that applies to video submissions, like digital video submissions?
Do you mean like, can you submit a video through the applicant tracking system?
Or like, does AI somehow, rank those videos somehow in your opinion or your experience?
So I've actually only had the digital interview experience when I was at Ernst & Young, because we piloted it right before I left for the interns that were coming on board. And basically what they did was they looked through each of the videos. We had professionals lined up to look through everything and give us their ratings. But there are, if I remember correctly, there are ways in which they can kind of, sort of like with resumes, how they can match keywords. There were ways in which they can pick up on keywords. But to my knowledge, they actually looked through every single video. But again, that was just when we piloted it. In terms of the applicant tracking system we work with, we typically don't do digital interviews. So the video interviews that we've done have been, real time, live. But yeah, I haven't had a ton of experience with digital interviews to be able to fully answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? If you can put it in the chat, that would be the best place to put it. My question for you, another question is, how much do you trust yourself in making a right decision in a candidate through a video interview? Because I in the very beginning, I've had many experience where people in the very beginning of the popularity of video interviewing, people were like, "Oh, I'm not sure if I get a grasp of who this person is, even though I'm talking to them live. I just don't feel it." I don't know if people or you still feel that way.
There are video interviews I've done recently where I'm just like, there's something about this person, like I was like, I don't think they'll be a fit. And not just because of a gut feeling. I can actually more times than not put my finger on it, where I'm like, I have a feeling that this is the person that, 2 months into this role, this is not what they want. Like they're going to quit on us. Right. So I have had those instances, and rightfully or wrongfully. I mean, I think that I've called it pretty good. Like in the past year when I say, okay, like we can hire this person, but they're going to leave. And sure enough, they leave, for whatever reason. But what we've done at our firm, because I'm back in the office every day, after we do a video interview, we invite the person into the office for an in-person interview. So before we extend the offer. And in the few instances that we haven't been able to do that, what we've done is in the past year and a half or so, any new hire that we bring on board, they go through a probationary period. So if within the first 2 months their performance isn't up to par, then, we don't move forward with them full time.
Okay, thank you. And one of the other things that people sort of worry about video submission is sort of discrimination, right? So some of the things is, we submit, people get this with resumes, like I better change my name because they might discriminate me as being an immigrant or not speaking English, whatever it may be. With video interviewing, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that's some of the concerns of people. Now that they see me, now that they know what I look like, I feel like I might get discriminated as a result of submitting a video.
I mean, I think it's so unfortunate that in the era that we live in, this is still something that's being brought up, but it's the unfortunate reality. However, what I will say is that diversity and inclusion is such a big topic. It's a hot topic, especially in the recent years. And so what I can say in terms of where I've worked and the experiences I've had, I've been very fortunate in that I haven't come across that from an HR perspective, where we look at someone's name or we look at someone's we look at the video and we're like, no, like we're not going to look at this person because either of their race or they have an accent or anything like that. I take great pride in never having been sort of associated with that or even witnessing that in terms of the roles that I've held and where I've worked. So what I would say is I would always tell someone to be true to yourself and sort of, if that's your name, then that's your name, right? Like, don't be ashamed of who you are. So that's sort of where I stand on it.
Great, thank you. I put in the chat, in our website, the STAR website has tons of resources, not only for resumes. I know Farzana talked about the resume earlier. There is a resume guide you can sort of download through that link that I just shared in the chat, but there's also helpful information about interview preparation. And I think what Farzana covered earlier with regards to, what's a good interview, that translates into the video. There's just that added extra layer that you talked about that's so much crucial and key when you are doing a video interview, whether it's live or something you have to download or submit later on or earlier on. So there are some resources in there. So please utilize them whenever you need help with interviewing. Anyone else have any questions? I agree. Okay.
This is just going back to what I was asking before. So, should I just send like a letter and maybe an email or something like that, and just like call back to see what they think, and maybe just apologize in any case if I haven't responded in a while?
I would say, given the kind of information we received, I think it might be best to sort of, I can stay back after the call, and if you want to talk to Marian and myself, I think it'll be helpful to kind of have a little bit more insight before giving you more guidance on what to say. I think I'd feel more comfortable having a little bit more insight.
Absolutely. But I think rule of thumb for anybody is always follow up, because people get busy. Just people are people, especially nowadays. I feel like when we're working from home, we're always working from home 24/7. There's never a gray area like there used to be. So I think you just have to make sure you follow up.
The thing is, can I be honest with you? Not too long ago, like an hour ago, I actually did send a letter already at the time, It's not like I can unsend it.
Yeah, I think like Farzana said, we can definitely talk to you afterwards because I think we just need a little more context with what we can give you, so that way we're not. The comment I made was more for everyone that it's so important to follow up. But definitely, I'll stay around afterwards, and so I can hear some more context about your situation, so we can give you sort of more valid advice on that. Also, after today, let's say, you really wanted to ask a question, you really need more help. Our office, we're working 100% remotely. So again, there are other offices that work with the graduate alumni. So if you got your graduate degree, I can definitely give you more where to go for that. But for our office at STAR, we service the undergraduate alumni. So if you got your undergraduate degree alumni, that's sort of we provide the resources for that. So after today, if you want to meet with one of us one-on-one, you have to log into Star Search, make an alumni career counseling appointment, and that's all done virtually. And we could definitely talk more about your interviewing if that's a concern for you. If you meet with us, we can do that mock interview module that I mentioned earlier. And then you could send that to your career counselor that you're going to be meeting with, and they can give you sort of some feedback on that. We have a couple more questions. So it says, "Am I not an alumni yet? Am I not an alumni yet? Can I still?" No, so the question to Ariel, I'll answer that because I think Farzana won't know the answer to that. No, because we do have a listserv, a newsletter for current students. So that one is basically we sort of curate events that are specifically for alumni. So if there's an employer event, let's say, and they want alumni, obviously that wouldn't make sense for a student to be there. So a lot of the information that's going to be in the newsletter really only applies to alumni. But for current student, we have tons of newsletters for you. So if you're subscribed to our STAR newsletter, we have plenty of information for that. Second question from Fergancio, is there an effective way to generate responses to behavioral-based questions? I seem to always have a hard time to find an example. Sometimes I believe it's because there are certain things I do at work that I see as part of the job and not as an accomplishment. So I have a hard time marketing myself.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things, and I can resonate with that, is sort of identifying ways in which you excel in your own role. I think it's sometimes so easy to identify how other people are excelling and hard to kind of, see what you're doing. That's really great. In terms of the formula for the behavioral questions, it's sort of like the STAR method, where you're basically saying, like, if they say, tell me about a time where, you had a challenging situation and how did you deal with it, right? So the basis of behavioral based questions is that so past behavior predicts future behavior, right? That's the theory behind it. That's why they ask it, right? Because the idea is, well, if you reacted this way in the past, you'll react this way in the future. Now, in a case like that, if you answer in a way that you're like, actually, I didn't like the way I reacted, this is how I would do it differently, then that's okay. But to answer your question, I think it's just the STAR method. So you kind of state the situation and you say, okay, this is what the problem was. And then this was my goal, the task, right? And then this was the action I took and the result that came about. So in terms of your role, if one of the ways to do it is if you have a job description, right? Sometimes you can kind of look at your job description and see what you do, and you can kind of find it that way. I don't know, Marin, if you have any other feedback you want to add to that.
I think, I think for me, using what you said, the STAR method, definitely in that handout that where you can download the interview guide. I think it's always good when you're applying for a job, look at the job posting, circle all the skills that they mention, and they're going to generate questions based on the skills that they're looking for. And so most of the time, the skills that, the examples that they're going to ask from you are based on the skills that they posted in the job posting. So make sure that you get 2 to 3 examples for every skill that they mention in the job, technical and soft, because, they're not going to ask you something like that's not part of the requirements that they're considered that's important for that position. But you're not going to always be prepared for every question in the interview. You do your best, but you just never know what they're going to ask you. So you do sort of have to do your best. And if you don't answer a question well, a thank you letter is the best place to re-answer a question. So if there's a question you just felt like wasn't such a strong answer and you were just thrown off for whatever reason, I think the thank you letter is a place for you to sort of readdress that question. And again, that handout, that information about that is in the handout too. But these are things you can discuss one-on-one with us, because I know today, I mean, we spent about an hour just talking about it. Definitely, I don't expect everyone to be expert interviewers after today. I definitely don't feel that sense, but I think this is to get you started to think about what's important, what employers really care about, and hopefully you practicing all this stuff, as Farzana said. So today is just to get you going, get you sort of energized about how important this skill is. Video interviewing skill. It is a skill. So it's just any skills you have to nurture and you really have to practice. And so I think we're just trying, don't be, this isn't just to get you started, and hopefully you work on it with a career counselor, which is important.
Farzana, I have a quick question as well. Just a bit more of a general question for video interviews. Similar to how sort of like with acting on the screen, they often tell you to sort of bring more energy. How much more energy do you have to bring to a video interview to sort of replace the fact you don't have that human element? Is there more energy you need to bring? And if so, how much more?
I think being more enthusiastic helps, but I certainly don't think like, eat a ton of candy before your interview and bounce off the wall kind of sugar rush. But I would say, your tone and your verbal counts for a lot more in a video interview because of the fact that some of the nonverbal gets scratched out, right? So I think if you can be a little bit more enthusiastic or be mindful of your tone even more. So when you answer a question, sort of be mindful, of how you're answering it. So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, even more with the video interview than with the in-person.
Mm-hmm. Sort of on that same vein, we just got a question from Lakeisha here. Do you have any information about poise and diction when interviewing?
So I would say sit upright, like when you angle your camera, sort of make sure, be mindful of what part of your body it's covering, right? So like, it can cover like kind of like a headshot sort of is fine. You kind of don't want it to cover like just half your face. You want to make sure that you're full, like I said, like a headshot. So up to your shoulders are showing. Be mindful, don't slouch. Like you can tell if I'm sitting back or like, if I'm more relaxed versus sort of upright. And then in terms of when you're speaking, test out your mic beforehand. So like I know for me, before I have any call, even if me as the interviewer having with an interviewee, I always do a test run with somebody in the office to make sure like, hey, can you hear me well? Is there an echo? Are the acoustics good on my end? Just to make sure that the person can hear me well. And then be mindful at the rate of which you're speaking. So I sometimes talk really fast, right? And I understand people who talk really fast because I talk really fast, right? So also be mindful of that. Like, am I talking too fast? Am I, are my words combined, or can you actually understand what I'm saying? I think awareness of all those things come into play more with the digital and video interviewing.
Totally agree. Anyone else have any questions?
I did want to add to the question about the marketing yourself for Genshio's question. So I also wanted to say, if you're unable to identify where you excel at work, and let's say your job doesn't do performance reviews, sometimes just asking your superiors for feedback can sometimes help you identify where you excel, right? So I think if you're having trouble in terms of identifying, what you're doing well in, that can be a way to figure it out. Because I think sometimes when you do something on a day-to-day, you don't realize how amazing you are until somebody else points it out. So asking feedback from a coworker, somebody who works with you closely, if you're willing and open to the feedback, it could be valuable for you.
Yeah, great feedback, great comment. Also, I want to add that, after today, people should sort of do like a SWOT analysis for themselves. And that helps you sort of get a gauge about where you are and what you need to work on. So that's something to work on. There is a question here Fortunately, I've been employed with the same company for 15 years. Great. I did have a few interviews sprinkle here and there in that time. Thanks for all the advice. What do you think, which area to work on in this new environment? I don't know, Will, if you want to elaborate on what you mean by that. I don't know.
If you mean skill set wise, I would definitely say technology. I think now that we've gone remote, we depend on technology so much that if you're looking for an area to work on skill set and you're not very tech savvy, this is the perfect opportunity to build those skills. If I'm answering your question correctly.
Yeah, if you want to just add more to it in the chat, that'd be great, Will. But I think definitely everyone should be sort of upskilling their resume. You can't go wrong with all the free stuff that are going on now. And if you didn't know, the New York Public Library, if you have a library card, they do give you free access to lynda.com, which it's just an online learning platform, which has tons and tons, thousands and thousands, I want to say like 200,000 different online learning platform. So it's really a great way to upskill your resume. And it is very something you could put on LinkedIn, something you could put on your resume. It's very much respected if you have it on your resume.
I would say also for Will, in addition to expanding his skill set, now's a great time to work on precisely what we've been talking about today, video interviews. Even if you've been at the same company for 15 years, it would be good to get some practice doing some video interviews, even if it's just more rehearsal type, just so you get used to it. Because as we were saying before this event even began, who knows how long this will continue, this sort of environment we're in, you know? There's really no definite timeline for when video interviews might be less common. They might be here to stay, in fact, moving forward. So yeah. Oh, I see. What is a good way to practice with video interviews? Farzana?
What is a good way to practice? So I do believe Marian mentioned something about mock interviews. Marian, is that something that is available to the alumni?
Yeah, it's more if you have access to Star Search. It's under resources and it's called mock interview, and it's called the mock interview module. And there are different like industries that you could sort of default your questions to. You can also make up questions on your own, and you could kind of, you could customize it. But you can have as many questions. What's great about that is that if you record yourself, you can see where the way someone will look at you when they're doing a video interviewing or when you're submitting. Because sometimes we think we're looking at the screen, but we're not. And so having that is good to have that mock interview module. You also can understand the poise and the diction that someone said, because we see it. I'm seeing myself now, but I'm wondering how I would look if I was doing a mock interview, if I would be looking at the camera, not looking at the camera, if I'm moving around a lot or not. So it's really good. And what's great about it is that when you it will generate a unique link, so you can send that to someone, and it's not taking up so much data on your computer or on your phone. It's also, you're not sending someone a huge file. And so what's great about it's just a link. So that's a great way to practice. And there might be other, if you didn't do your undergraduate, I'm sure there are other resources that are available to you outside that are similar. You could also just do your phone, record yourself, I guess, too, just to see how someone would look at it from that lens. Right.
I would say also don't be afraid to ask a friend or a mentor or someone that you feel comfortable with professionally to critique your videos and your interviewing skills as well. That could be, they might find things you don't see yourself.
Great, thank you. And here's a resume question for Farzana. When should you use a functional type resume versus a chronological one?
So this takes me back to my days as a peer for career. So I used to work at the Career Center when I was a student at Baruch. So hopefully I get this right. So a functional resume is basically that pulls out certain skill set, right? So typically I haven't seen many functional resumes, and the few that I have seen have come from individuals who have a ton of experience. So they have worked for decades, possibly. And so they have like a ton of management experience that instead of talking about every single experience they've had, they pull out their management skill set and they just highlight some accomplishments that they've done in that regard, like in that one area. Whereas chronological is the more common one. Typically a resume shouldn't be more than 2 pages, but you know, if you can get it to 1 page, that's ideal. So the chronological is the more common one, where you just list your resume, your experiences from most recent to oldest. I would say if you're looking to use a functional resume, that's when it's, let's say you have a ton of management experience and you're applying for a management heavy role and you want to highlight it, but you can't fit it all on like 1 page or 2 pages, then you use a functional resume to highlight your accomplishments in that area.
And it's also very common for career changers to have a functional versus a chronological one. So the handout, the website that I sent earlier that has resource where you can download the resume guidebook, that has about 3 to 4 pages worth of information for functional resumes. So
one of the tips that I also wanted to give that was just general interviewing tips, because for some reason it's happened more recently when I've done interviews, is just make sure that you never speak ill of any previous role or boss that you've worked with. For some reason I've had a couple of interviews in the past month where I found that the candidates sort of speak ill, right? So it's one thing to have a bad experience and to kind of spin it in a way where you say what you learned from it, but it's another thing to say, like, you know, your boss, you know, wasn't somebody who was a good person, right? So it's be very mindful about how you communicate an experience that probably wasn't entirely pleasant for you. Because that's going to be reflective. You know, if you're speaking to a potential employer, they're going to look at it as, wow, like if you're going to talk about that, about your previous employer, you know, it's just a matter of time if we were to bring you on board that you would probably talk about us like that. So just be mindful about that, and be very strategic.
very good advice. Yes, I will send that. I will resend that. So, sorry, where is that? Okay, I think here it goes. Here's the link for the resume. It's a Word document that you can download. Any questions about not only video, it could be interviewing in general. So if anyone has any questions about interviewing in general, but video interviewing and video all is definitely relevant nowadays. I can't think of any big companies that companies in general that aren't doing video interviewing now.
I want to remind everyone that we will send out a recording of this as well as the slides. So if you missed anything or if you want to consult the video that Farzana mentioned in her presentation, you'll be able to do so. We'll also send some additional information that Marian's been sharing about Star Search and how to get your account. We also have another alumni event coming up next week that's going to be regarding financial literacy. It's going to be whether you should buy or rent your home, which is going to be an interesting topic. So I'll send a link in the chat bar as well to register for that if anyone's interested. Just sent that in there. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. Thank Farzana, thank Marian. This has been a really great event. For those who want to have an additional couple of questions for Farzana afterwards, feel free to stay on the Zoom. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording of this. We will share the recording in an email in the next couple of days. So I will